Hello guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Skills and Abilities. Today we're going to be going over the Rabies skill. Ah yes, the Rabies skill. I can't remember if I've already done this one or not, but who cares, I'm doing it again. The Rabies skill is, well, complicated. It's a lot more complicated than I think people realize, and it has basically only one synergy, which is the Poison Creeper. The Poison Creeper actually does not interfere with the Rabies damage, even though poison damage normally competes. The Poison Creeper is actually a special form of poison damage that applies separate from Rabies. So you do not have to worry about Poison Creeper competing with the Rabies damage from your ability. Now, let me go ahead and reset this boy real quick. We're going to go ahead and throw some points in here. And once we have our Rabies maxed out, you'll notice that it does moderately okay damage. We'll go ahead and get some strength in here so that we can actually wear our equipment, of course. And that's going to increase our damage quite nicely. Now we have 26,000 to 27,000, which is not even as high as you can go, by the way. I believe the upper limit of Rabies is something like 61,000 damage per bite. Which is a lot of damage, but it's also poison damage. And poison damage tends to have really large numbers, but not necessarily, you know, it doesn't really work out to be as crazy as it seems. Although it does have very high numbers here, Rabies functions very oddly. It's also poison damage, which means that other poison damage can potentially override it, which is also kind of bad. It also doesn't override itself, which is so we need to talk about the way that Rabies applies so that you know what you're dealing with. All right, so essentially what happens is when you bite a monster, the monster is infected with a contagion. The contagion fires missiles. That's right, actually fires missiles. You can't see them, but it fires missiles with a range of about 4.3 yards, which is far enough that most monsters will be infected. And it actually pierces through the initial monster and can hit multiple monsters. So for instance, if I bite this monster here, it will shoot little missiles out, which will hit these monsters, and then they will shoot little missiles out, which will hit those monsters, and so forth and so on. Now, the important thing to note here is that all of them will become uninfected at the same time. So no matter how many times they're hit by the missiles, no matter how many times they're infected, the duration of the contagion is essentially the same, and it stays the same for that entire bite. Now, if I were to apply a second bite, for instance, at a later time on this girl, that bite will have a different timer than the first bite, and will expire at a different time. Now, a lot of this is very complicated because poison damage also has another hidden effect that a lot of people don't know, which is when you apply negative resistance, especially in forms like Death's Web and things like that, it actually decreases the resistance of the monster, not only in the damage they take, but also in their resistance to the amount of time that the poison lasts. So negative enemy poison resistance actually becomes a increase to the duration of the monster as well. So for instance, let's say for instance I had negative 100% enemy poison resistance, to the point where the monster was literally at negative 100%. So we're talking about a monster maybe at 0% resistance, and then I apply negative 100% resistance to that monster. Then that means that the length of my poison is now increased 100%, which is kind of drastic. So getting as much negative enemy poison resistance as you can actually has an extremely strong effect on the damage output of Rabies. On top of this, Bramble and other items like Trangul's Claws that have plus poison skill damage can also have pretty drastic changes in your damage output. As you can see, if I take off both Bramble and Trangul's Claws, my damage goes from 17k to 18k. And then I put them back on, I go to 27 to 18k. So I'm literally getting almost, what is that, a 10k damage increase between Bramble and Trangul's. And Bramble's kind of a poor roll at 31% poison skill damage. Now, Death's Web is not directly shown, although it does have the +2 all skills, which I lose when I take off the wand. It's not directly showing the effect of the negative enemy poison resistance on the monster, but the more negative enemy poison resistance that you can get with this build, the better. It's also important to note that negative enemy poison resistance applies after the bite. Because of the way that the ability spreads in little missiles, it actually can be applied after you bite the target. So for instance, there's a couple ways that you could take advantage of this. One way would be to get the crazy unique item. It's a rather low-level unique item. It's called Plague Bearer, which has +5 Rabies. You would put that on your offhand over here with a Spirit Shield, which would give you 5, 6, 7 Rabies. So you would have +7 Rabies on your off swap. You would bite the target with your +7 Rabies, then switch back to the Death's Web, and as the little missiles fire, they would apply the negative 50% enemy resistance after the application, which means that you can maximize the damage of Rabies by doing some interesting things. Also, it's important to note that monsters that are immune to poison can still spread the poison. So they become contagion bearers. As you can see, the skeletons here have the poison effect on them, but they are immune to the poison, and they are still infecting everything nearby. Now, with the use of the Sunder Charms now, you can break the resistances of these monsters, so it is actually pretty sweet to be able to just simply sunder the immunity, allowing you to dish out some pretty crazy damage. I just realized I have 27,534 life. I'm pretty sure this is a hacked character, by the way, so don't think too much of it. There's more to go over with Rabies, and a lot of it is extremely technical. It involves the interaction of poison with other sources. Basically, you really don't want other poison sources with Rabies. Poison damage, as well as venom and other poison sources, are basically competing poison sources when it comes to Rabies. And if they have a higher damage output than Rabies, they will overwrite Rabies. However, it is important to note that after the duration of that poison is finished, Rabies can actually reinfect the target with the Rabies because of the way that it fires off the little missiles, and it continually just keeps firing the missiles every certain number of seconds. In fact, I do have that information here. So the Rabies Plague fires a random horizontal direction it fires one Rabies contagion sub-missile in a random direction every 4 frames, which can hit other targets within a radius of approximately 4 2/3 yards, 7 subtiles of the infected. So 4 frames is essentially, if you actually take that, 25 frames is a full second. So if you divide that by 4, you end up with 6.25. So you can essentially have about 6.25 missiles fire off per second with Rabies, infecting other targets nearby. And as you can see, it lasts for 16.8 seconds. So the Rabies contagion will continue to spread for 16.8 seconds throughout the entire group of monsters. It cannot be reapplied to the same target, unfortunately. So, like, say for instance, I had a bunch of equipment that, changed the level of my Rabies. One of them was maybe like a 12-second Rabies, and the other one was a 16-second Rabies. If I bite the target with the 12-second Rabies, and I try and switch to my other equipment that has the 16-second Rabies, The 16-second Rabies will not overwrite the 12-second Rabies until the 12-second Rabies is finished. So the 12-second Rabies actually has to go through the process of completing itself before I can reapply it with the higher version. They can also reinfect themselves, which is rather interesting. So even if there's no other monsters nearby, the missiles can actually fire in a direction that actually hits the same target again. So the monster can continually reinfect himself for the entire duration of the ability. So even if, for instance, the resistance of the monster might be very high, and maybe it wears off quicker than it otherwise would, you don't really have to worry with Rabies because the monster will just continually reinfect itself over and over and over and over and over again until the duration of the contagion is finished. The duration of the contagion is always the exact same number of seconds as the duration of the poison listed on the tooltip. So 16.8 seconds is the duration of the contagion. Now, 16.8 seconds is not always the duration of the Rabies because of varying factors with monster resistance, as well as some very rare monsters that have poison length reduction, like the Ancients. But the contagion will still continue to do its job for the entire duration. Now, I do have a very, very good article here that is posted about the mechanics of Rabies, and it goes over everything in extreme detail. And if you'd like to learn more, especially in terms of like maximizing damage output with Rabies and other such things, then this is the best article to go for. And I'm actually going to link this in the description of the video for you guys, so you can go over some of the more advanced stuff, which really doesn't, I'm going to be honest with you, which really doesn't need to be like talked about during this video, because this is like min-maxing, like putting on like the exact right equipment, biting the target, taking off the equipment, putting on better equipment, letting it spread, then putting back on the other equipment, and then biting again, and maximizing your damage output by literally swapping equipment back and forth. This is all min-maxing stuff, but if you are trying to build a Rabies Druid, this is the kind of stuff that you're going to want to look into. It's also important to note that attacking with Rabies over and over again is pretty useless. You don't really need to continually attack with this ability. If you would like to attack while you are in there spreading Rabies, then I would recommend using Fury or Feral Rage. This way that, you know, you can do something while you're in the midst of the monsters. Of course, you're not going to be able to attack with something like Death's Web, but there are definitely some items that would work very well as Rabies Druid items. One specific item is the new Plague Sword, which is actually a pretty sweet weapon in terms of damage output for the Rabies Druid. Not only does it have poison skill damage, but it also has a very nice lower resistance proc. And of course, I don't seem to have a plague on hand. I know I have a plague on several characters. No, not North Star. North Star is using an ethereal Astrion's Iron Ward, so that's not going to work. I believe... the Badgerine. I think he has one. Yes. So this has a 25% chance to cast level 15 Poison Nova, which shouldn't interfere with your Rabies all that much. The 20% chance to cast level 12 low resistance, though, is absolutely mint for a Rabies Druid, because it will offer you another way to reduce the monster's resistance even further. Now, a very good combination would be to have this on your main hand and something like Death's Web on your other hand. Attacking with this one, because it has the lower resistance, and hopefully applying the lower resistance, and then switching to the Death's Web for the negative 50% enemy poison resistance. Now, this one does, however, have negative 23% enemy poison resistance on it, which is extremely useful for Rabies Druids, and it's kind of like a really neat all-in-one package. It's not going to give you the best damage output for Rabies, but it does have +2 skills, it does have lower resistance, and it does have negative enemy poison resistance, all of which is very crucial to making the Rabies Druid work. all in all, when it comes to the Rabies Druid, things like lure resistance, things like negative enemy poison resistance, things like plus poison skill damage are really the mint things that you need to make the character work properly. And Rabies is really just one of those abilities that kind of just does its own thing. The really cool thing about Rabies, though, is that it's very minimal investment. You really don't need a lot of points to build Rabies. It's literally 20 points in the Rabies skill itself and 20 points in Poison Creeper. And with a 40-point investment, that leaves you with a large number of points to put in pretty much anything else you want. Whether you want to build Werewolf, Lycanthropy, put some points into Fury or Feral Rage so that you have an ability to attack with while you're not, doing the Rabies thing, or building a summon druid to go alongside the Rabies is definitely an interesting choice. You could even invest some points into things like Cyclone Armor, or maybe even grab Hurricane so that you could utilize that as you're running around. With Rabies, because of its such a low investment skill, it definitely opens the door for you to do other things as opposed to just Rabies. Now, of course, you can full invest into the werewolf form, so you could put 20 points in Lycanthropy, 20 points in Werewolf, 20 points in Rabies, and that's still only 60 points, and then 20 points in Poison Creeper, and that's still only 80, and then you could throw 20 points in Fury, and that's, 100, and you still have 15 points left over to spend where you want. You could even throw those somewhere else. So Rabies becomes a very interesting build for the Druid because it opens up the door for you to move into other things. You can max out your Oak Sage, or you can max out your Heart of the Wolverine, or you can get a little army to run alongside you, to run interference, which actually isn't a bad idea because they run interference for you as the Rabies spreads, so you can just kind of stand there and do your thing. Or you can set up a very nice melee druid alongside the Rabies druid so that you're tapping the targets with the Rabies and then allowing them to, to bleed, essentially, or to drain the life away. And then as they're draining their life away, maybe you swap over to a weapon so that you can actually dish out some pretty good Fury damage. Or maybe you just use it to build up Feral Rage so you can run around really fast and steal some life to stay alive. Whatever it is that you're going to do on your Rabies Druid, you have options. Anyway, as always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watching my videos, even when we're just talking about the green plague ability known as Rabies. And I hope I've demystified the ability a little bit for you. And as always, thanks for watching, and keep watching.